So in a series of teachings of the Buddha's core teachings of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, last time I was here, we started a talk and discussion about the first factor of the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is the Buddha's map, the guide, the path to liberation, to ending suffering in our lives and in this world. We mostly got stuck on karma, on what creates positive and negative merit and karma in our lives last time. There's a little bit more discussion about that as the Buddha goes on from acknowledging that in order to be liberated, we do need to understand karma. We need to understand that every intentional, volitional action has an outcome. I think it was the teacher Ruth Dennison that said, karma means you don't get away with nothing. Mm-hmm. She usually follows that up with darling. You don't get away with nothing, darling. After the initial conversation about the importance of understanding the truth of karma, that karma is not a philosophy, it's not an idea, it's not optional actually, it is a irrefutable law of existence from the Buddhist perspective. It's not an idea, it's reality. In some ways, right understanding, I kind of feel some temptation to say, to kind of dumb it down and say, this basically just means you have to understand that it's important to be kind, and it's important to be generous, and it's important to be forgiving, and it's important to not be violent, and it's important to not be selfish and dishonest. It's important to practice mindfulness, to understand that without present time awareness, this meditation that we did tonight, mindfulness of the present is the beginning. It puts us in contact with pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. To understand that if we're not aware that that cough is unpleasant, then we're just automatically suffering. If we're not aware of what our relationship is to sounds, to smells, to taste, to sensations, there's a sort of automatic aversion to the unpleasant and clinging to the pleasant. So part of right understanding is beginning to, through mindfulness, through self-awareness, internal introspection, seeing what's the cause of suffering. And it's not pain that causes suffering. It's hatred of pain that causes suffering. And it's not pleasure that causes suffering either. Sometimes we get so into renunciation that we start to kind of demonize pleasure. And we better renounce all forms of pleasure. Pleasure is evil, and it's greedy if you want pleasant sensations and sounds. And it's not pleasure that's the problem. It's attachment to pleasure. It's craving. It's clinging. It's needing pleasure. It's needing the absence of the unpleasant and the presence of pleasant. That is the problem. Part of what we're asked to understand in a Buddhist context is that we have the ability to be happy, to be at ease, to be free from suffering. We have that ability. We have that, maybe ability is too much. We have that potential. Because most of us don't have the ability yet, but we have the potential to have the ability. to end suffering in our lives through a radical shift in our relationship to pleasure and pain and neutrality. In wise understanding or appropriate understanding or right understanding, this first factor of the Eightfold Path, the Buddha points to the three characteristics: the importance of understanding impermanence, the unsatisfactory nature of all conditioned phenomena, and the impersonal, or the not-self aspect of being. Anicca, anatta, and dukkha. As these three truths, the importance of understanding these three truths, these three characteristics. And it's not so much a theoretical, again, it's like karma. This isn't theory or philosophy. This is what is true, what is revealed when you're mindful. Perhaps you're seeing it for yourself already on different levels, that when you pay attention, it becomes clear, it's revealed. Everything's impermanent. Every sound arises and it passes. Maybe it re-arises, but then it repasses. And it's a process of arising and passing, and arising and passing. There's no constant. It's all a process. Impermanence is really the culprit a lot of times around suffering. The cause, the core. Especially around pleasure. When your experience is pleasant, what's the problem?
It's going to end.
Clinging to an impermanent, pleasant experience. It's going to end. Bad news, impermanence. This shit ain't going to last. No matter how good it feels, it's not going to sustain itself. It's an impermanent pleasantness. These factors are not sustainable. We can't hold on to anything. And when our experience is painful or unpleasant, then impermanence becomes good news, actually. Then we're really grateful. This is going to pass. This really hurts, and this process of grief or heartbreak or whatever it is, we take refuge in impermanence. It will change. It will pass. So half of the time, I don't know if it's half or not, but some of the time, impermanence really sucks and is totally unsatisfactory because pleasure. And we want it to last, and it doesn't last. And sometimes it's liberating, impermanence. We're so grateful for it. I think in Tibetan Buddhism, sometimes they refer to formations as self-liberating or suffering as self-liberating, which confused me at first. So I was like it liberates all by itself, and it's just a nice way to talk about impermanence. I was like, if you don't do anything, it will pass. The suffering will end. All you have to do is allow it to liberate itself. Even this sometimes hard to understand truth, characteristic of not self, or the impersonal nature of being, that there isn't a solid, separate, continuous self within this human experience. Feels very central to me. I understand it most easily through the lens of impermanence. That what the Buddha is saying is not that there is no self, that there's just no permanent self. That the self that we experience as I and me and mine and this feeling of I is created by this mind and body. And it doesn't last forever. It's actually constantly changing. It's impermanent. It's in process. It's not so much I exist as much as I am an unfolding process. Anicca, anatta, dukkha. The impersonal, impermanent, and often unsatisfactory nature of life in a body. The pleasure doesn't satisfy because it doesn't last long enough. And the pain certainly is unsatisfactory for obvious reasons. Some other pieces here in the Right Understanding, kind of philosophical points where maybe in the context of ancient India or 2,500 years ago in India, there seemed to be always this kind of battle between eternalism and nihilism, and this kind of philosophical debate around enlightenment and what gets enlightened, and is there a permanent self or is there an impermanent self? And the Buddha always trying to help people understand and claiming that I teach a middle path. He said, over and over saying, I don't teach eternalism. I don't teach that there's a soul that lasts forever. And I also don't teach nihilism, a soul that ends or a self that ends at death. And one of the lists that comes under Right Understanding is the unprofitable questions. He says people that get too attached to these unprofitable questions, such as, he says, should anyone say that he does not wish to lead the holy life under the Blessed One, unless the Blessed One first tells him whether the world is eternal or temporal, infinite or finite, whether the life principle is identical with the body or something different, whether the Buddha continues after death? Such a one would die before the Buddha could tell him all of this, would answer these questions. He says, it's as if the man were pierced by a poison arrow, and his friends, companions, and near relations should send for a surgeon. But that man would say, I will not have this arrow pulled out until I know who the man is that wounded me, whether he is a nobleman or a priest or a tradesman or a servant. What was his name? To what family did he belong? Was he tall or short or medium height? And the Buddha says, you would die. He said this kind of a man would allow himself, this kind of a person would allow themselves to die with these philosophical conjectures around, is it finite, is it infinite, what happens to an enlightened being after death? He says, therefore, a person who seeks their own welfare should pull out the arrow, this arrow of pain and sorrow. And that's truly for us to understand, that Buddhism is not meant to be a cosmological philosophy, that it's meant to be a practical tool, that it is a surgical removal of the causes of suffering, the arrow of suffering that is created by greed and hatred and delusion, by clinging to pleasure, by aversion to pain. Often in spiritual circles, we can get so lost in philosophy. I remember reading something from a teacher, like a young reincarnated Lama, and he said, he was like a teenager in this interview, and he said, I just see my job as kind of like a doctor or something, where people come to me and they tell me how I'm suffering, and then I give them their prescription. I say, go do Tonglen, or, do Vipassana, and he said, but Americans are more interested in discussing medications than taking them. It's like everybody that comes to my class wants to be a pharmacist. They want to talk about the cure. They want to talk about the philosophy of it rather than just take your fucking medicine and stop suffering. Some of the unwise considerations that the Buddha encourages us to avoid are around reincarnation and the questions, have I been in the past? This is not conjecture. This is not a theory. This is the direct experience. And maybe the thing about, one of the things about Buddhism that I love so is that that this is experienceable by each one of us. That it's not to be believed, it's to be digested. That you can know the arising and passing away for yourself, not as a theory, but directly through your meditation. Another story here about these questions about did I exist and how does rebirth work, and did I exist in the past and was that real, and what about this life and the future, and the analogy that he uses here about what's reborn and what part of us is in it if there's rebirth. He says it's just as the cow he says it's just as from the cow comes milk, and from milk comes curd, and from curd comes butter, and from butter ghee, and from ghee the skim of ghee. When it's milk, it's not counted as curd or butter or ghee or skim of ghee, but only as milk. And when it's curd, it's only counted as curd, and when it's ghee, da-da-da-da. Just so was my past existence at the time real. But unreal the future and present existence. And my future existence will be at that time real, but unreal the past and present existence. Does this make sense at all? Your past life was milk. And your future is curd. And eventually you'll become clarified like ghee. And my favorite piece of right understanding is when the Buddha says, understand to meditate and destroy. He says, in this respect, one might rightly say of me that I teach destruction and annihilation, that I propound my doctrine for the purpose of annihilation and destruction, that I herein train my disciples for the certainty I do teach destruction and annihilation. The annihilation, namely, of greed and hatred and delusion, as well as the manifold evil and unwholesome things. And this is directly where where I've taken our one of our mottos around here: meditate and destroy. That this whole path is about the destruction of greed, hatred, and delusion, the destruction of our identification and attachment to that which causes suffering in our lives and in this world. And the traditional Buddhist presentation is that, as understanding that what we're going for, that liberation that we're going for, is the end of this cycle of rebirth, is entering into a state of what is called the deathless, the cessation of karma, he says. He says, through the fading away of ignorance, through the arising of wisdom, through the extinction of craving, no future rebirth takes place. For the actions which are not done out of greed, hatred, and delusion, which have not sprung from them, which have not their source or origin in them, such actions, through the absence of great greed, hatred, and delusion, are abandoned, rooted out, destroyed, and do not spring up again. To recap, if you would like to be liberated, if you'd like to be free from suffering, we could say it the other way. If you want to be happy, if you want to be at ease, you better know about karma. And you better find a way to put your life, your actions, your intentions, in harmony with wholesome acts, with creating wholesome karma, with practicing kindness, with practicing generosity, with practicing forgiveness. Understand the importance of wise actions, and then act accordingly. Understand impermanence. How different would your life be if you really lived in harmony with impermanence? If you didn't cling to anything that was impermanent? Tremendously different, wouldn't it? If there was no more clinging to the impermanent? Because basically, there's no more clinging then. Because all formations are impermanent. Knowing impermanence, the more insight we have into it, the more we see it clearly, the easier it becomes to let go, to stop clinging so much, to stop creating all of this unnecessary suffering. This feels so core to me, and perhaps a major reason why the Buddha referred to this path, this process, as being an act of rebellion and being against the stream, because clinging is normal. Clinging is the status quo. Clinging is what we're born into. And being asked to practice non-clinging is a radical request. It's a radical practice. And it takes a lot of training of our mind, of our heart, of our perception to be able to start meeting pleasure with non-attached appreciation, meeting people with non-attached appreciation. And that's the goal, and it is the potential for non-attachment, for non-clinging, is here within all of us. But it's a skill that is developed over time. It's a gradual awakening, as someone said. Impermanent, impersonal on some levels, and unsatisfactory. Unprofitable questions. Don't worry about the philosophy. Don't even worry about rebirth or what's reborn or any of that stuff. Just change your relationship to permanence and impermanence. Change your relationship to pleasure and pain and neutrality. Not theories, not conjecture, but direct experience of knowing the impermanent, the arising and passing within this being, within yourself. Understand that everything that you are looking for is already here inside of you. You don't have to get compassion. You don't have to gain wisdom. It's here in your being, and meditation will help you destroy what is blocking it. Will help you change your relationship to what is blocking your own natural wisdom, your own natural compassion, your own heart's desire to be generous and loving and kind. It's there. It's under there. It's part of who we are. But it's blocked by craving. It's blocked by aversion. It's obscured by ignorance. Meditation helps us get underneath to the core, to the source, to your Buddha nature, for lack of a better word. These are some of my thoughts about the completion of the first factor of the Eightfold Path. Next time I'm here, we'll talk about the second factor of the Eightfold Path, which is sort of the same talk. You're going to get this talk like 3 times. First, it's about understanding what's happening here. And then it's about aligning our intentions with what's happening here. And then it's about acting in accordance with what's happening here. So these first 3 factors of the Eightfold Path, wise understanding, wise intention, and wise action, are all kind of in the same arena, and the Buddha is saying it. But they're actually different. He said, first you have to understand it in order to have the right intention. But understanding by itself isn't enough. Then you have to have intentional actions to follow up your understanding. That's like faith. Faith by itself is nowhere. You can believe, you can understand all day long, and if you don't take the right actions, may any goodness that comes from our practice be shared with everyone everywhere.